welcome to The Long Road. My name is Chris Roberts. I'm only going to be speaking for a few minutes today because I have a long clip, and studio is going to be closed next week for Martin Luther King. So instead of running a rerun, I just want to bring something across, and it's from a conference that I attended in November in Washington, D.C., a conference on improving education. And it's a non-political conference. There's Democrats, there's Republicans, there's independents, a lot of people there. Their goal is to get the best quality education for our our youngsters, our children. And I don't agree with everything that was said. I don't agree with everyone's opinions. But to me, when it comes to knowledge, to me, I want to be as much of a sponge as possible. I want to get as much unbiased information as possible, so I can make good decisions. And one of the things that I have found over the years, it doesn't matter what the source is or what the person's objectives are. There's usually good information or good ideas to get from all different sources, and I have no problem stealing good ideas or good methods no matter where it comes from. And sometimes people would say, well, you can't agree with that person because that person's a Republican, or that person's a Libertarian, or no, you have to only accept this information because you're a Democrat. To me, that's just a lousy way to do it. And I got a lot of good information from this conference, and I've been there before, and I hope to go back again next year. And as a result of this conference, I submitted a couple of bills this time, and these are my first bills that I've submitted myself. And for one, basically, if we have an 11th or a 12th grader go to Keene State College or River Valley College and take some courses, why shouldn't that course and that grade count in their transcripts instead of just saying give individual credit for it? If you go and take a course at Keene State College, you get a B on it. That B should be on your transcript, and when computed to the GPA, you should be able to get the upgrade factor that someone taking an AP course would. So if we want to motivate our kids to learn better, to learn quicker, and someone wants to go out and take a college course and pass it, then that individual should get credit and rewarded for that. Another one is if a student wants to be able to go and take a couple of courses at one of their local colleges, let's protect the student. Let's ensure that the student can take part in all the extracurricular activities, whether he or she wants to play basketball or football. And so even if that student basically in his senior year wants to take 4 courses, wants to take a full load at the college, why prevent that individual from not be able to still be a high school student? Another one is the dual enrollment program, and create a commission to do that and look at it, because around the country there's a lot of kids who are graduating out of high school at 18 and also graduating with an associate's degree because high school is not exactly motivating them or challenging them, so they're taking college courses. Some are going in and taking vocational courses and getting a degree in vocation, and then going in and going right to work. So if you go in, if I have a daughter and she goes and takes advanced college courses at Keene State College, I don't have to pay for room and meals. There's a whole bunch of stuff I don't have to pay. So when my daughter would then graduate with an associate's degree, I may have saved myself $15,000, $20,000, $25,000 before he or she goes on to college. So they do really good at King State College. They apply for UNH. They transfer to UNH. So there's ways to motivate the kids and to reward the kids. And so I hope you enjoy the video, the question and answers. You're going to see some high-powered people in here, and they all want to improve the quality of education in the United States. And so enjoy it. I'll see you on the long road again. And thank you. And if you see me, if you have questions, ask me.
Good evening, everyone. I hope you enjoyed your dinner. We are going to have a very important and interesting panel presentation this evening, and I have the privilege to introduce the participants. So I'd like to start with Dr. Richard Haass. Dr. Haass is president of the Council on Foreign Relations, former director of policy planning at the United States Department of State, former special assistant to President George H.W. Bush. Dr. Haass has his undergraduate degree from Oberlin College and master's and doctorates from Oxford. Mr. Joel Klein is the CEO of Amplify, which is the education division of News Corp. He's also the executive vice president of the Office of Chairman at News Corp. Mr. Klein is also former chancellor of the New York City Department of Education, where he oversaw 1,600 schools with 1.1 million students. And in 2002, introduced a comprehensive reform strategy called Children First. He's also former Assistant U.S. Attorney General, former Deputy White House Counsel to President Bill Clinton. His undergraduate degree is from Columbia, and he has a Doctor of Laws from Harvard University. Dr. Condoleezza Rice is a professor of political science at Stanford University. She is a former United States Secretary of State, the second woman to hold the position, the first African-American woman to hold that post. She's the former National Security Advisor under President George W. Bush. She's also co-founder of the Center for a New Generation, which is an innovative after-school academic enrichment program. She's the author or co-author of numerous books, including 2 bestsellers. Her undergraduate degree was at the University of Denver, master's from Notre Dame, and PhD from the University of Denver. So Mr. Klein and Dr. Rice are going to be discussing a report that they have authored, which has been published in March of this year by the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, among many things, this report notes that while the United States invests more in K-12 public education than many other developed countries, its students are woefully ill-prepared to compete globally. One tidbit, according to the results of the 2009 Program for International Student Assessment, a tool that measures performance of 15-year-olds in reading, math, and science every 3 years, United States students ranked 14th in reading, 25th in math, and 17th in science. The lack of preparedness poses threats on 5 national security fronts: our economic growth and competitiveness, our physical safety, intellectual property, U.S. global awareness, and U.S. unity and cohesion. Please join me in welcoming these panelists to discuss this disturbing and important report.
Thank you.
You gonna sit in the middle?
Right.
Okay.
You sit next to me. Yeah. Well, welcome to this evening broadcast of Morning Joe. And, the energy in this room is real testament, I think, to 2 things. One is how this issue of educational reform has ripened It's a combination, I think, of need, of the talent we see in this room has coalesced around this issue, the new technologies. But there really is a sense that the moment has arrived. And the other is Jeb Bush. I'm a great believer that two things matter in life. One is ideas and the other is people. And that's the real driver of change. It's the real driver of history when you unpack it all. And Jeb's a perfect example in what he's doing. And he's, in some ways, the coming together of a person with real talent and drive and commitment, but with a set of ideas. And this is one of them. And again, so the fact that you're all here, I think, is the greatest salute you could give. Condi and I come out of the national security background. When we were youngsters, we used to mess around with something called the RAND bomb calculator. And it used to calculate what was known as the CEP, the circular error probable, of the blast effects of nuclear weapons. Here we are today. We've traveled a considerable distance, and in some ways the reason is, and the other person who comes to mind is Mike Mullen, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. When he was asked, what's the greatest national security threat facing the United States? He didn't say Al-Qaeda. He didn't say a rising China. He didn't say Iran. He didn't say North Korea. He didn't say climate change. What he said was the deficit and the state of American society. And I think that's exactly right. And you can look at questions of the budget, you can look at questions of infrastructure, you can look at immigration policy, but above all, it's education policy, because this is the future. And we're not talking about our physical infrastructure, we're talking about our human infrastructure. And Joel is someone who has dedicated the most recent phase of his multi-phase career to this. And when he isn't discovering the best restaurants in Brooklyn, he is focused on improving the lot of young people in this country.
It's supposed to be the other way around.
It's supposed to be. So I'm going to tell you how Condi's been dedicated to this issue in lots of ways. But about a year and a half ago, I called her up. And he said, Condi, I want you to do something for me and with me. And she said, Richard, I'm too busy. Don't even start. Don't even go there. And I said, okay. And by the way, we've bet on many football games and all that. So I said, before the end of this conversation, you are going to agree to what I'm going to ask you. And she said, no way. I said, right. I said, we at the Council on Foreign Relations, who spend all of our time working on things like China and Mexico and all the traditional foreign policy issues, we've moved our agenda, and increasingly we're also focusing on things domestic. And what we want to do is a report on education. And we don't want to repeat what everyone else has done, but what we want to do is look at education through the prism and the filter of national security and basically ask the question, what is the relationship between the challenges above all in K through 12 education and the national security of the United States? And it didn't turn out actually to be a terribly hard sell. First she cursed me, because she knew I had her at that point. It didn't even take a follow-up phone call. She was there. And she and Joel then co-chaired this task force report, basically our version of a commission. And the whole idea was to take people of disparate backgrounds, educators, but also national security people who often don't come together in the same space, and essentially say, or raise the question about what is the relationship between the educational challenges we face and the national security challenges we face, and to put this, in some ways, to recast this issue, to reframe this issue for a broader audience, in some ways beyond just you all. Because in some ways, the fact that you're here reflects the fact that you're here, at the risk of being redundant. But what we wanted to do is get it at people who read, foreign affairs rather than some of the Chronicle of Higher Education and journals such as that. And so what they've done, the two of them with about 24 other people, helped put out this report. If you haven't read it and you'd like to read it, it's on CFR.org. And it is there. And the idea was not so much to resolve everything, but to put the issue center stage. So let me just turn to them to start and basically say, what is let's just deal with the basic question, which is what we write. Is there a close link between, don't play you after you, between the state of K through 12 education and the state of America's national security? Secretary Rice.
Thank you very much, Dr. Haas. Indeed, I was delighted that the Council on Foreign Relations, an organization with which I've been affiliated for a lot of years, was prepared to look at what I'll call the domestic sources of American strength, because without the strength at home, we don't lead abroad. And so I thought this was very foresightful for the Council to do this. Secondly, I was looking forward to the opportunity to work with Joel, who I'd gotten to know and who I admire so much for what he did in New York City and what he continues to do on education reform. And it really was a great task force. And I would just make 3 brief points about this link that I think we all found between national security and education reform. First of all, the one that is most evident when you hear some of the statistics that Betsy mentioned, our global competitiveness is at stake, and that's generally where people go. If you're going to be 17th in math and science, eventually you're going to lose the innovation race. You are not going to be able to educate people for the jobs that are available. Those jobs will go elsewhere, our global growth and competitiveness. And that, in some ways, is the most obvious link. If we are not preparing people for the workplace of the 21st century, then we are not going to long be the world's most competitive and innovative economy. A second, in some ways, more surprising one for me was brought to us really by Pete Guerin, the former Secretary of the Army, who talked about the problems in our education system and the relationship to the armed forces. The inability of some fully 70% of Americans to actually qualify for service in the armed forces ought to be a red flag for anyone. Now, yes, there are other reasons for that, incarceration, obesity, but a fair amount of it is that people can't pass the basic skills test to get into the military. So just imagine that. A country, developed country, most powerful country in the world, and we can't get people to pass the basic skills test to get into the military. In some ways, the analog of that for me as Secretary of State was realizing how few people start to learn foreign languages in a timely fashion, meaning when you're younger, how many people can actually find something on a map that is not the United States of America. The fact that we don't have people who are prepared to go into the intelligence agencies, so we're robbing ourselves of talent in literally the national security infrastructure of the country. But third, and to me, most importantly, it's a tragedy that people will not be prepared for good jobs and will therefore go on the dole because they'll have nowhere else to go. It's a tragedy that people can't serve in the armed forces or the foreign service or the intelligence agencies. But the United States of America is held together by a great national creed, not by ethnicity, not by blood, not by religion. Our national creed is an aspirational narrative that it doesn't matter where you came from, it matters where you're going. You can come from humble circumstances and you can do great things. And the only way that that is true is if you have access to a high quality education. And if it ever becomes the case, as it is increasingly now, as I've said many times, that I can look at your zip code and I can tell whether you're going to get a good education, then the social fabric of this country has no chance to hold together. And we will be pit one against the other, those who are capable and those who are not, those who are employable and those who are not. And I can assure you that the sense that you might not be able to control your circumstances of birth, but you can control your response to your circumstances, that will no longer be the way that Americans think about themselves or about each other. And that gives way to envy and aggrievement and entitlement. So to me, at core, the real problem for us in national security is not just our competitiveness abroad, not just our institutions of national security, but this great national narrative, this cohesion that has made us the country that we are.
10028.
Richard, let me just say, I think people responded that way, Connie, because the words you just said, and frankly the words Jeb said this morning, are some of the most important words this country has to hear. One of the things that bothers me enormously is we just went through a presidential race and we didn't hear those words. And we heard it in your speech and in Jeb's speech and a few other places, but those words were not part of our national debate. And yet when you think about the fact that the glue that holds this country together, quaintly called the American dream, is likely to become, if we don't change course rapidly, the American memory, is something that's a very, very powerful notion. And I give Condi a lot of credit because when I was chancellor in New York, I had known her very casually. And in one meeting, she said to me, she said, "You don't understand. You think this is an education, an equity, and even an economic issue. This is America's national security issue." And she and Richard had the foresight to bring the council to bear. And why I thought that was important is because, let's be candid, most of the people in this room, if you didn't get it, you wouldn't be here. But we are an echo chamber. We talk to each other. We feel smug about the fact that we understand it, but we are not remotely transforming the country. I found the luncheon discussion today important, but a little dispiriting, because we don't have the time to really nibble around the edges. As we speak right now in America, for the first time, we are raising a generation that's going to be less well-educated than their parents were, at a time when we need to raise a generation that's much, much more well-educated. We're raising a generation, as Connie said, where you can predict educational outcomes based on zip codes, and all too often those zip codes are correlated with race and ethnicity. And we're raising a generation in which there is no great public outcry about this issue. This will decide what kind of nation we'll be. Everyone wants to worry about the fiscal cliff, and it's obviously a very important issue. We'll resolve that issue. But today, in the third grade, in cities like New York and Chicago and Detroit and elsewhere, kids are now being condemned to a life that's going to be very humbling and very frustrating, because I know for a fact those kids are not going to be able to read, they're not going to be able to compete, and they're not going to make it up some miraculous way in the 12th grade. So having this twist of focusing on national security may lead this country to understand that if we don't get off the path we're on a path to a very different kind of America. And I think the person who deserves enormous credit for teeing that issue up and driving this task force is Secretary Rice.
Well, let's talk for a minute about what it would take to, if you will, close the gap between where we are and where we want to be. I mean, one way to think about it is in STEM and just sort of basic skills. But one thing we've decided at the Council on Foreign Relations is that also there's a large issue of content. What got me to this point was two things. One is when I taught at the Kennedy School, I was stunned that the non-American students knew a lot more about American civics and the basics of American foreign policy in the world than the American students. More of the non-Americans had read de Tocqueville, Bryce, The Federalist than the Americans. That was one thing that caught me up. The other was a recent experience where I spent some time with a young man who was graduating from Stanford in computer sciences. And I started asking him about what he studied beyond computer issues. And I was shocked that he could graduate from this amazing university where Condi teaches, and he hadn't had one economics course or one history course. And it's what led us to basically say, okay, we're going to start producing at the council curriculum material. We're now going to be producing simulations and core courses and modules and so forth that high schools and colleges can use to try to close this gap between what it is kids know and what it is they need to know in order to be ready for this world that, like it or not, is going to fundamentally affect their lives. But what's your sense for both of you? Because you really come from an educational background classically. Condi comes from a foreign policy, national security background. What's your sense of what the priorities need to be to, if you will, to fix the problem?
Well, maybe I'll start and pass it to Joel. I come from a national security background, but I also was provost of Stanford for 6 years. And so seeing the product of the educational system, if you will, gives me a perspective on what it is we need to try to achieve in that period of time. And obviously at Stanford you see the very, very best. But I will tell you two things. Number one, if you have low expectations of even the best students, they will live down to them. Right. And so I come at this with a belief that the most important thing, come back to content, but the most important thing is that whatever you're teaching them, you have to have very, very high standards. You know, frankly, I'm not much for the self-esteem movement. You know, every kid gets a trophy.
But you're doing a great job.
Yeah, right. I mean, you know, we've all, I'm a musician myself, and I think that the arts are important. But how many of these little performances have you been to where kids are running all over the stage and people say, oh, isn't that cute? Well, actually, no, it's not. Let them practice. It will be better if they know something. So my first and most important point is high standards, whatever you teach them. Then secondarily, I do believe that the Common Core, which we talked about in the report, task force report, has a chance to give us some grounding in not just the substantive knowledge, but the ways of acquiring knowledge that students need to have now. I believe in STEM, obviously. As I said, I would like them to be able to write. That is a very undervalued skill, particularly these days. I think it would be very useful if indeed some civics education were included. But the most important thing is whatever we're going to do, we need to do it in a common way. And now I'll say something that's slightly controversial. The country, and I mean the United States of America, has to have some sense of what all kids are going to acquire as a set of skills levels, which is why I think the Common Core is a good idea. It doesn't mean that we don't have local control of education, and the states are obviously the place where this is going to get done. It does mean, however, that in a highly competitive and highly mobile labor pool, Alabama and California and Texas and Vermont have to have some sense that their kids have a common basis of knowledge. And so since the Common Core came up through the National Governors Association, was in that sense a local initiative, I would hope that we can have more discussion about how to make certain that it's implemented.
I agree with Connie. I was watching when you talk about a self-esteem movement, Michael Gove, who's really doing Herculean work in the United Kingdom right now. He got all excited. So let me tell you, here's the zeitgeist. In the K-12 system, and this I think goes to the heart of it, in the K-12 system right now, there is this deep belief in the controlling zeitgeist is that we need to develop a kid's self-esteem so she can perform. All we got to do is reverse that and tell people they need to perform in order to have self-esteem. If we get that right, we will change the system. I think in addition to things, I think Common Core is critically important. I think elevating standards is important. Jeb laid out 5 things. For me, I think there are 3 things that have the potential. They're not easy to achieve, but I think they are the things that could change the system. First of all, if I could wave a wand tomorrow, I would make K-12 teachers America's heroes. They would be the profession that we all aspired to. They would be seen like in places like Japan, where they call teachers sensei, reflecting what they call lawyers, doctors, university professors. Think of the difference between the way we view university professors in America and the way we view K-12 teachers. And places like Finland have this right. We have it 100% wrong. We have decided to trade unionize rather than professionalize. We have decided that seniority is more important than excellence. And when you do that, what you end up with a race to the bottom, and that's what we've created in K-12. Second of all, given where we are, I think, and I agreed with Jeb's comment today, a lot of people disagree, I think choice is critical, and it's a fundamental backbone of the report. And while it was not unanimous, it was enormous support from lots and lots of quarters. No one in this room would voluntarily agree to send your kid randomly to a school in D.C. Understand what I just said. No one in this room would send your kid randomly to a school in D.C. You would move, you would go to private school, you would pull strings, but you would not just say, I'm down with that. On the other hand, whose kids go to those schools? In New York, we had an acronym for it. They were called OPC, Other People's Children. As long as we send other people's children to schools we won't send our children to, shame on us. And the way out of that is choice. And the way out of that is choice. No, I insisted on it for my daughter. I think we should insist on it for other people. If you think about K-12 versus post-secondary, we've got a lot of problems in post-secondary, but people from all over the world come to America to look at our post-secondary schools. Nobody comes here to look at our K-12 system. There's a reason for that. Post-secondary are not guaranteed a catchment area. They're not a monopoly provider. And in the absence of competition, we're going to continue to hobble along. And the third thing, I think, is something that Giselle Huff and others have been pushing for a long time. I learned about it for the first time from her when I was chancellor and I was here, and she said, stop trying to fix a broken system, create a new and effective system. And we've got to rely on technology like everybody else does to empower our teachers, engage our students, and change the whole service delivery process. So to me, those three things are the mission critical issues.
Let's one thing, because we are looking at the whole question of education, national security, we're all English speakers. What's your sense of the proper place for language training? At what point it ought to be introduced? To what degree it ought to be a priority? Where should it fit?
Well, I'm a proponent of kids learning languages earlier just because it's easier, right? If you have ever tried to learn a language at 35, you'll know what I mean. It is just easier when you're younger. Your brain imprints that way. It's like music. I would hope that we, but look, to be quite blunt, I'd first like to make sure they can speak English and write in it, because too many of our kids can't do that. But one question is whether there is some way to spread the task, if you will, of some of the things that our kids need to learn. We may not be able to do everything in the school day in the schools. I've been very active with the Boys and Girls Clubs, and Betsy mentioned that we started something called the Center for New Generation out in East Palo Alto, East Menlo Park, and Redwood City. And it's a high-quality, very intensive after-school and summer program for kids 3 hours after school. And and there they get languages, and there they get instrumental music, and they get some of the things that maybe can't be fit into the school day, because as Joel reminded me, we have the shortest learning day and the shortest learning year in the developed world. I doubt that we're going to be able to extend the learning day in most places, and so perhaps finding other alternatives. You know, I learned to speak French, but I actually learned it at age 9, but not in the schools. I learned it because, believe it or not, my father, who was a Presbyterian minister, decided with my mother that all educated children should speak French. And so on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, we were dragged down to the church to take French with Mrs. Donetta Thornton, who was the French teacher from the high school. So there may be some ways to add to the curriculum outside of the schools as well.
So hanging around with Kanye, the one thing I've learned, if I come back as anything, I want to come back as the son of a Presbyterian minister. I just really, I have been so shortchanged in life.
See, Joel was at Hebrew school Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays.
So Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and what good it did. But really, By now, I would be playing the piano, speaking French. I mean, but I want to just make two. Richard, when you first called me about this, you said something that struck me in terms not just of foreign languages, but global history. We live in such a different world, and our kids, by and large, are clueless about this. It's not just a language thing. These kids you're talking about who know more about de Tocqueville and know about the Constitution also know a whole hell of a lot more about the Middle East and about China than our kids know. If you came to the average high school in New York City and asked kids about what's happening in the world, I think it would take your breath away. I really do. And I've watched, even domestically, Justice O'Connor bang on his drum in terms of civics education in the United States. And this is really a serious problem. So I think that's one part of it. The second part, and why I think technology can matter, is because we don't have to limit the school day anymore to the hours inside the school room. There's much more we can do. I've watched people, there's some folks here from Kungskapskolan, it's a bad brand, but it's actually a great school in Sweden. And Jeb went there to visit him. I've been there to visit them. And they've managed through creating a portal in ways, and I met a kid at that school whose mother was a nurse and had one day a week to take the kid with her so she couldn't be at the school, but she could work on the internet in that time. And you know, Jeff Canada, who's one of my heroes, had a big idea, and that is, he said, look, how can we're the only profession that admits we're failing at what we're doing for our kids, and we all go home at 3 o'clock. I mean, there's got to be a way to think differently about the dimensions of this challenge, and I think technology is part of that problem. But I want to go back to where Candice started, because as important as music and art is, and as important as global history is, and so forth, kids who can't read and kids who can't do basic mathematics are not kids who are going to master global history, or are going to do higher order or critical thinking. And so we have got to figure out both how to build the foundation and then build on the foundation. Right now, tragically, we're doing neither.
Kind of you began by pointing out the fact that in many measures, the United States versus other countries, we're falling behind. And 30, 50 years ago, we ranked a lot higher than we are now in basic skill sets. What is it that others are doing better, or to put it another way, more positively, what can we learn? What is it that we can learn and, if you will, import here from others?
Well, let me answer that, and then just a cautionary note on the importation idea. I think one thing that we clearly can learn is Joel's point about teachers. The way that the profession is treated, the people who go into the profession, the training that people get in the professions. Look, I was provost of a university that has a very high-ranking education school. But I think there are real problems in schools of education in the way that teachers are trained. And so one thing that we can look is how the profession is treated in other places. Secondly, obviously, I think the standards issue is a major one. One thing that I learned on the task force, kids in Korea are learning in grade 3 what our kids are learning in grade 5. Why should that be the case? There's no reason for that, and so we obviously are not having high enough standards. Now, the reason I say there's a caveat, I think there's undoubtedly a lot we can learn from others, but we're not China and we're not Singapore, and we're not Finland. We are a big, diverse, federal, very complicated country. And so one question that we asked is, what can we learn from ourselves in other parts of the educational system that are more successful? Joel brought up tertiary education, post-secondary. The universities in this country, universities, colleges across the board, are the gold standard internationally. What do they have that the K-12 system does not have? Number one, they have competition, and that's why I'm also a major advocate of school choice. And secondly, they have variety. It's not one size fits all. You can go to a community college, a small liberal arts college, a big research university, a small research university. They have variety. And so one of the things that we tried to do in the task force is to say, what are some of the sources of American excellence in other areas that could be imported into the K-12 education system? And I think that, for me, confirmed that the monopolistic tendencies in the K-12 education system may be the biggest problem. So I think there are things we can learn from others, but there's also an awful lot we can learn from ourselves in other areas of American life that are more successful.
But Connie made this point time and again, and it was so impactful in terms of the task force. But think about the two things that give people hope about our country is that we still believe, or want to believe at least, that merit matters most, that it's not where you came from, who your people are, but what you accomplish through your hard work, through the application of your talents to the challenges you face. And the second thing is the dynamism and innovation. There's no place in the world that innovates like America does. Look at our school system. Merit is irrelevant to the equation, and innovation you don't even hear about. Somebody asked me what it's about in education. I said, it's hard to tell. There hasn't been any in such a long time. We couldn't even capture it in a bottle. So if you think about the dynamism and the merit, if we infuse those in our K-12 system, and that goes to the ed schools, which in Finland, whatever the comparison is, think about this, for every 10 people who apply, they accept 1. In America, for every 1 who applies, they take 10. I mean, it's just got this system. And what Kate Walsh and the people are doing, no, it's true. What they're doing is really important. But I would say to you, if we're going to fix this problem, we've got to transform a system that doesn't believe in merit and that eschews innovation to one that has the dynamism that is the hope of the future of this country, and it will be the hope of the future of our education system.
So building saunas in American schools is not what we learned from Finland.
But let me give you an example. The last thing I did before I left the public school system in New York, and think about this, is I was with somebody who's the president of IBM, and he was a friend of mine, and I said, you know, you've been a good friend, but truthfully, you haven't done enough for our schools. He said, what would you like me to do? I said, here's the idea. I'd like to create a school, take a 2-year community college, mix it with a 4-year high school, and train people to be technicians. People select this school. At the end of 6 years, if they get out of this school, they get their associate's degree, and you, IBM, certificate them in technology. And if they meet your criteria, you hire them. And Sam Palmisano, to his great credit, agreed to do this. And we opened a school in New York City a year ago, and the people are lined up around the block to get into it. It is such an exciting dynamic. Now, everybody said, well, you can't mix the community colleges with K. Why can't you mix the community college with K-12? Because the bureaucrats worship at different churches, so you can't mix them. So, I mean, really, what kind of way is that to think of? And you can't bring the business people in to certificate because only the educators can certificate. Now, what the hell would the educators know about certificating people in technology? So we managed to do it. And the guy I admire most is Rahm Emanuel, because he called Palmisano and he said, hey, look, what did you do? You just gave Bloomberg this great school, he said, and I thought you were my friend. So he said, all right, Rahm, I'll give you one too. And Rahm, to his great credit, he said, no. He said, you did Bloomberg first, you got to give me 5 to make me significant. And they did 5 of them in Chicago. But if you think about it, why can't we open this thing up to the differentiation? I mean, we do this cookie cutter thing as if all these kids are the same. Somebody was asking in a panel I was at today, well, what's the difference between college and career ready? You know, and everybody on the panel, I could see them, they look like, you know, deer in the headlights because nobody wants to answer that question. Well, one way to think about that question is why don't we create the kind of meaningful career and vocational opportunities for kids so that they have applicable skills that are valuable in the market. Not everybody, in my view, is going to do a 4-year liberal arts, and that's not to knock 4-year liberal arts because I think they're highly valuable. But we can create a differentiated system in which people who have different career paths and different ways to go. What we can't do is simply abandon kids, which is what we are now doing in K-12.
I'm going to ask a few people here to improve the quality of the questions. And we're going to begin with Hannah Scandera, who's the Secretary Designate in New Mexico for the Public Education Department.
Good evening. We started the conversation tonight with Dr. Haas saying people and ideas matter most. We've put a lot of ideas on the table that are important. If you had to articulate your #1 idea that changes education and therefore our national security, our economy, and our nation, what would it be? And if we don't deliver on that, what do we look like in 20 years?
Well, the task force, Hannah, said choice. And I think that's because we are where we are. People have pointed out other countries have non-choice K-12 systems that work. But I think, for me personally, if you look around the country now, two places that are worth looking very hard at. One is New Orleans, because it was in some respects a natural process after Katrina where they could start over again. And while there's a lot of room for improvement, great things are happening. The other place is Harlem, where I think there's now more choice in that little neighborhood. And if you look at the results, which is amazing, about a third of the kids in Harlem in the third grade are in charter schools. But what's amazing is the Harlem district went up, and this is apples to apples, went up dramatically from when we started this intensive choice process there to now. It was something like 28th out of 32 districts. Now it's about 16th. And not only did the charter schools outperform almost everybody, but the public schools, which were 28th, actually moved up significantly themselves. So I think those are two instantiations of models that we should develop. I think what Nirav Kingsland down in New Orleans has written about in terms of the difference between reforming and relinquishing, and Paul Hill's work on portfolio, I think are really important ideas that need development. So that's where I would come down.
I actually would agree that it's choice, and for two reasons. There's the catalytic effect on the system, if you will, because going again from the tertiary system, if a college isn't getting applicants, it will either go out of business or it will do something to start to get applicants. So there's a catalytic effect on the underperformers of having people be able to make choices with their kids, and especially for poor parents. Someone said on our task force, we can't have an opt-out system. We have an opt-out system. As Joel said, that's why houses are expensive in Palo Alto and Fairfax County, because people opt into those districts with their kids, or they vote with their feet to private schools. So the only people stuck in failing neighborhood schools are poor people, and that's the height of inequality, and that's why I've called it a civil rights issue. Those people need choices, but it will have then an effect on the individual child. More kids will be better educated, and I think it will have a catalytic effect on the system. So I would also say school choice.
I would only add standards to the I think it's
Absolutely.
important that we as a society set very clear expectations for what it is we want. Michael Gove's the Secretary of State, not in the sense that Condoleezza Rice was, but as a member of the cabinet there, the Secretary of State for Education in the United Kingdom, where I got educated. So I look forward to hearing your questions, sir.
Thank you very much, Richard. Can I say, Joel and Condoleezza, it's been an absolute pleasure to hear you. It was worth traveling coach class on United Airlines
The ultimate compliment.
to hear you speak.
It's the first time I've ever worried about your judgment, Michael.
Austerity is biting in Europe. Richard, you made the point that ideas matter when you're changing things, and they also matter in national security. And one of the reasons that America won the Cold War is that it recognized this was a moral conflict as much as anything else. And America realized that it couldn't win the Cold War, and it couldn't win non-aligned nations, in particular, if it still had the scandal of segregation in the South. So winning the civil rights battle at home was a precondition of winning the fight for liberty across the globe. Now, I think, looking from the outside, if you'll forgive me, that there's the same danger now.
Absolutely.
When I go to China, and I criticize them for their lack of democracy, they say, yes, but we're educating all our people. You don't educate all yours in Britain and in America. And then when I've been in the Middle East, and I've talked to people there who are on the edge of radicalism, they say, look at the grotesque injustices in your British and European and American nations. We would never allow that under an Islamic state. Now, these are self-serving, versions of the truth. They're lies even. But nevertheless, they have power. And I wonder to what extent American political leaders can articulate the case that actually, as long as there is inequality driven by education in America, that America's capacity to provide the moral leadership that the world needs is compromised. And then when people hide behind the arguments of states' rights, and they say, no, we don't want, core common standards because we need to, protect our states' rights. One of the things it reminds me of is the arguments in the 1960s about people who said that states' rights trump the rights of citizens. And in particular, and I speak as a conservative, it worries me that people don't accept that, as you said, Secretary Rice, this is the civil rights challenge of the time. If you're a poor citizen in Mississippi, behind the mask of states' rights, there is no choice and no diversity and no pluralism for you. Almost all of the schools are bad schools in that state, and almost all of the children face a bleak future. So surely, both the party of Lincoln and the Democrats can get together and say, we need to solve this civil rights battle now in order to ensure that America can lead again as it has so magnificently in the past.
Well, first of all, I'm awfully glad you made the trip because
I'll pay for you to go business class next time.
I couldn't agree more. And indeed, the United States, I believe that the greatest source of our leadership abroad is not our military, though we have a wonderful military, not even our economic strength, although obviously we have tremendous economic strength, but it is this great American creed that resonates around the world, that you can come from humble circumstances and you can do great things. That has led people, by the way, to come here for generations from all over to be a part of that, which is why we've been the best at mobilizing human potential from all over the world through immigration. But it's not just mobilizing human potential from abroad, it's mobilizing human potential from all segments and all classes of America so that you are not trapped in your circumstances. Education was a way out. I will just tell a very brief story because it's my own family story. I am third generation college educated. Now, why is that? That's because John Wesley Rice Sr., my grandfather on my father's side, when he was a young man in Utah, E-U-T-A-W, I'm not kidding, Alabama, decided he was going to get a college education. So he asked how a colored man could go to college. This is 1919. They told him about Little Stillman College, 30 miles away, saved up his cotton, went off to Stillman College, paid for his first year. Second year comes along, they say, well, how are you going to pay for your second year? He says, I'm out of cotton. They say, you're out of luck. He says, so how are those boys going to college? They said, well, they have what's called a scholarship. And if you wanted to be a Presbyterian minister, you could have a scholarship too. And my granddaddy said, that is exactly what I had in mind. And our family's been college educated, and by the way, Presbyterian ever since. Now, he knew somehow about that transforming power of education. But the wonderful part of that story is that out of Utah, Alabama, sharecropper's son, in 2 generations, the Secretary of State, his granddaughter. America, whatever people have thought of our policies around the world, whatever people have thought about us in any other way, that story resonates. And if that's no longer true in the United States of America, then we will not lead because we won't have the moral fiber from which to lead.
Yeah, I obviously agree with this, Mike, but I would just say one thing. I think it's even, in one sense, as important as America's leadership role in the world is, I think the domestic consequences are even greater for this country. When we have a country in which there's virtually no social mobility, if you look at the percentage of kids from the bottom quarter of the economic spectrum and how few of those are going to high-quality colleges today, and social mobility is really drastically different. We don't want to fully get our heads around that. So I don't think this is just in terms of our global leadership. I think we can eat ourselves up from the inside. I really believe the question for, Tom Brokaw wrote about the greatest generation, where people would go fight and die for this country with pride because they believed in exactly what Secretary Rice is talking about. I think the question for our generation is not whether we'll fight and die literally, but whether we will fight for an America that believes in the American dream or whether we allow it to become the American memory. As long as we divide ourselves, what's going to happen is the hollowing out of the middle class. And if that happens, we're going to lose hope. And if we lose hope, the global consequences will almost pale in comparison to the domestic consequences.
I mean, again, this comes back to the national security case for improving education. It's to produce the cadre of people we need to staff the various government agencies and the military. It is for reasons of competitiveness. It's for reasons of citizenship, because we're all going to have to vote and make other choices. And I think what Condi was getting at is really fundamental. Foreign policy is almost, to borrow on the old saw, it's too important to be left to the diplomats. And the foreign policy we set by our example is in some ways as important or more important than any talking point given to any ambassador. And we talked about ideas. The battle for ideas continue. And over the last 5 or 10 years, you've seen all sorts of people. You get in your travels talking about Singapore or China, that somehow this is the future. Well, it's not. And one of the ways we'll make sure it's not is actually going to be by dealing with the issues that are central to this conference here today.